Okay, so we're going to begin with the general introduction, which is that there are three kinds of commandments, and this idea you heard before. It appears we discuss this from time to time, but here we're just going to we're going to be brief, maybe a paragraph or two. So here we go. There are three categories of mitzvot in the Torah. There's mishpatim, which is the civil laws that we understand. There's the edut, which is testimonials, and chukim, which are the decrees. Mishpatim are mitzvot whose observance is required even by human intellect. In other words, the Talmud says, even if the Torah was not given, we would know that stealing is wrong. How would we know? Says the Talmud, we would learn it from the animal kingdom. We would learn it from the ant. Because, I don't know, I never asked them, but apparently the ants don't steal from each other. And then the Talmud says, if the Torah was not given, we would learn the idea of modesty from the cat, because the cat is very modest. Okay? So in other words, from just looking at nature itself, you get certain awareness of what morality is. You don't need the Torah for that. Okay, but the Torah does include some of those categories, things that the human intellect could derive on its own. With regard to edut is testimonials, the mitzvah that we do to commemorate the past. Though logic alone would not mandate their observance, we can understand their rationale once they have been commanded by the Torah, right? I don't know that we would come up with the idea not to eat bagels for 8 days, not to eat pasta for 8 days. I don't know if I would come up with that. But now that the Torah comes up with this idea to commemorate the past, okay, makes sense. Then you have chukim by contrast. Chukim literally is decrees. Decrees by contrast. Come on. By contrast, are mitzvot which have no intellectual basis. Indeed, they contradict reason, and so must be observed with kabbalat ol, which is Hebrew for acceptance of God's yoke. In other words, there's a class of commandments. We do it not to commemorate the past. In other words, not because logic dictates, not because logic understands, but because God tells us to do. Now we're going to get to a very interesting idea and say, what is a mitzvah? All mitzvot originate with God's will. In other words, why do we do it? We don't do it because it makes sense. We do it because it's God's will. But the other mitzvot, they're God's will, but God's will is articulated in a logical format. Don't steal. God wants us not to steal, but now it comes down to a place that we can understand. So when we do it, we don't necessarily feel God's will, right? We're feeling the logic. But when you come to the chukim are the decrees, now you know I'm only doing it because of God's will. You see what I'm saying? I'm saying that when there is also a reason, then you don't necessarily feel the connection to God's will. Because you say, why am I not stealing? Because it makes sense not to steal. But when I say I'm going to do a mitzvah that makes no sense, then in other words, essentially all mitzvot are God's will. The only question is, was the God's will enclosed in logic? And if it was enclosed in logic, then you don't necessarily feel the will. So let's read it inside and then see if we can come up with a metaphor. So here we go. In mishpatim and edut, the logical mitzvah and the testimonials, God's will had been confined and enclosed in intellect to the extent that that our thought processes can appreciate it. With regard to chukim, by contrast, God's will retains its transcendent nature. Even though they exist within our material framework, the chukim reflect the essence of God's will, which is connected directly to God's essence. This is why they cannot be grasped by mortal intellect. So this is a very interesting thing. What we're saying is, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, what's deeper within the person? What I understand or what I want? So according to the Kabbalah, your will is much more connected to you than your understanding. This is what I understand. Okay, that's not me. If I want this, will is who I am. What I want is who I am. So the point here is the mitzvot that we do solely because of God's will are still connected to God, closer connected to God's essence. As opposed to the reason, once there's a reason, okay, so the reason is not as close to the essence of the person as the will. So in other words, all mitzvot begin as will, but then the question is, are they articulated in logic? And if they are, then to us, we sense the logic, we don't necessarily sense the will. So for example, just to think about this in terms of a metaphor, let's say I'm doing something for you and you say, okay, you know what, let's go. What do you like to do? You like to go to listen to classical music. Okay, let's say I like listening to classical music myself. Okay, so I'm going, well, why am I going? I'm going because it makes sense to me. I'm going, in a sense, for myself. What happens if I don't like classical music? If I don't understand it or it doesn't speak to me? Now, when I'm there, every single moment when I'm at the concert, I'm cognizant that I'm here for you. I'm not here for me, right? If I understand it, then I'm here for you, but I'm also here for me. What I never understood is people say, we're going to go on a date. Where are you going to go? We're going to go see a movie. Okay, so you're going to see a movie. First of all, you're not speaking to the other person. The point is, there's something completely distracting you. You're not thinking about the other person. Okay, we're going to go on a date. We're going to my favorite ice cream store. Okay, fine. You're going because you like the ice cream. In other words, there's nothing wrong with that. Yes, of course, deep down, I want to have ice cream with you and not with somebody else, right? So we understand that every mitzvah, even if I understand it, there is some will over there. Will means I want to connect to you. I'm here because it's your will, not because it's my will. But if it's a mitzvah that there is no other reason why I'm doing it, only because this is what you want, now I feel much more connected to you. So that's what we're getting at. We're getting at even when I do something that makes sense, it's every mitzvah is essentially God's will. But because it's God's will, the way it's articulated in logic, so for the recipient, yeah, I'm doing it, it makes sense, it's fine. Okay, it's nice that you're here. It's nice that God wants this too. All good. Nothing wrong with that. But the relationship on the relationship level and feeling connected to God's essence, that you don't have with the will as much as you have it with the mitzvot that are logical as much as you have it with the mitzvot that don't have any logic. I'm only here for you because classical music means nothing to me. Similarly, the observance of chukim requires a commitment stemming from the essence of one's will, reflecting the Kabbalat Ol and Bitul, which are rooted in the essence of the soul, and which transcend one's conscious powers. Okay, so this talk, the way it's written, it's in the Rebbe's books, the earlier ones are much more dense. So this is very dense. In other words, every paragraph is another idea. What we're saying here is as follows. We're saying 2 points. Just like we said that the mitzvah that's just God's will is closer connected to God's essence because the person's will is deeper connected to the person than his understanding. So from God's perspective, the mitzvah that's just will, when I do the mitzvah that's just God's will, I'm closer to God. Also think about the person, what it takes to do a mitzvah that I don't understand. So that requires a commitment that's deeper than logic. When I do it because I understand it, I'm doing it because I understand it. But there's no deep commitment here. Commitment to the other person, commitment to somebody else, the commitment to the other person is much deeper and it stems deeper within the person specifically because I don't understand it. In other words, both ways, both when you look at God's perspective and when you look at the person who's keeping the mitzvah, on both perspectives, the will is much deeper within closer to the essence of God, as well as the essence of the person, because it takes much more commitment to do something that I don't understand. In this light, the connection can also be drawn. Okay, we spoke about this in the past, but in this light, a connection can also be drawn to the Alter Rebbe's interpretation, which associates chukim with engraving, chakika in Hebrew. So the word for decree, it is related to the word for engraving because, you say something is set in stone. When you engrave it, means it can't change. So engraved letters possess an advantage over written letters, for engraved letters are part of the substance on which they are engraved. Written letters, by contrast, are merely added to the surface of which they appear. Okay, we'll read one more paragraph and then we'll see what we make of this. This also reflects the advantage of chukim over edus and mishpatim. Edut and mishpatim, from the perspective of both God the commander and man the commanded, do not represent the expression of will in a pure sense. Instead, will is mixed with intellect. Chukim, by contrast, reflect the expression of man's and God's essential will and connect the essence of man's soul to the essence of God without the addition of any external factors. So that's basically a summary of what we're saying. When you do a mitzvah that's just will, there's no intellect involved. I'm not doing it because it makes sense. And on one hand, I'm connecting to God's essence and connecting with my essence, because the will to connect comes from a deeper place within myself than just the logic that it makes sense to me. Right? I don't want to be stereotypical here, but the idea here is, you always say, what's the purpose of buying flowers for people or for women or for men? I don't know who likes flowers. So seemingly it's a waste of money. It lasts for a day. You may as well, I don't know, either invest in, buy a bond or something, or buy something that will last. And maybe part of the point is that the reason why women like flowers is because the men don't understand it. Right? So because you don't understand it, now we know you're doing it because of the commitments to the other person, not because it makes sense to you. Because if you're doing it if it makes sense to you, then the connection is not as powerful. Like the guy who wanted to buy his wife a gift for her birthday, so he buys her a vacuum cleaner. She wasn't very happy with that, but to him that was very logical. I see something that can help you, fine. Flowers makes no sense. Makes no sense. Okay, that's a good gift. So in some sense, we're saying the same thing, but we're saying here on a more Kabbalistic level, and we're analyzing that both from the perspective of the person commanding, from God commanding, and the perspective of the commanded. If there's no logic and it's just will, you have a deeper connection. It comes deeper from within God, and it takes a deeper commitment within myself to fulfill that commandment. So that is step one of our building here. That's the foundation. If we understand this, we can continue. If we don't, let's discuss it now, and we'll fight about it now before we continue the construction of our edifice over here. Okay, that's in general about all the commandments, and now all the commandments, and now we're going to get specific within the commandments that are not logical. We're going to get to this, the mitzvah of this week's parsha, the red cow, which is not only does it not have a reason, but it has inherent contradictions. So it makes it even not even neutral. It makes it difficult to understand and difficult to classify. So let's get to the next. Okay, the fundamental example of chok, in other words, the decree, is the mitzvah of the red heifer, the red cow. With regards to this mitzvah, even King Solomon, who had grasped the most sublime truths and was able to comprehend the rationale for the other chukim, said, this is from the Medrash, based on a verse of King Solomon in Kohelet. So the Medrash says like this: that's King Solomon, who is considered to be the wisest of men, says, I was able to comprehend all other difficult passages of the Torah. But with regard to the passage of the red heifer, I asked, I researched, and I sought. I said, meaning I wanted to, I said I will become wise, but I saw that it was distant from me. So this is a verse from King Solomon. Amarti v'achakma, I said, I'm sorry, right here. I said I will become wise. See, the quote should have been before I said. Mistake, I think. I think this is a mistake. Amarti achakma, I said is part of the verse. I said I will become wise, but I saw that it was distant from me. That's what King Solomon says. What's King Solomon talking about? What did he want to become wise and what was distant? So the Medrash therefore explains that he says, I wanted to become wise, meaning I wanted to understand all the commandments of the Torah. And he says, I was successful with all the commandments except with this mitzvah, the mitzvah of the red heifer. The Medrash continues, the rationale for this mitzvah was revealed to Moshe, our teacher, alone. As the Medrash states, the Holy One, blessed be He, told Moshe, to you alone will I reveal the rationale of the red heifer, meaning nobody else could understand it. This is one of the reasons, the next paragraph, as I alluded to, I mentioned it earlier when I said the opening statement of this parsha. This is one of the reasons why the Torah introduces the chok, the decree of the red heifer, with the phrase, this is the statute of the Torah. The Torah uses such wording rather than this is the statute of the heifer, right? That's what you would expect. It's introducing the statute of the heifer. We say, no, this is the statute of the Torah, because what we mean is, or this is the statute of the sin offering, because the red heifer reflects the Torah in its totality. For the essence of all the mitzvot, even the mishpatim and edut, is God's transcendent will. With regard to the other mitzvot, however, God's will isn't clothed in intellect. Nevertheless, The essence of even those mitzvot remains transcendent. So this is an interesting point. In this week's parsha, when it says, this is the essence of the Torah, what we're basically saying is, every mitzvah is really a decree. Every mitzvah is really God's will. The fact that we understand some of the mitzvot is God's will is also articulated in logical terms, that is okay, but that's still God's will. And therefore, the red heifer is the essence of the entire Torah because it's the essence of God's will. In the mitzvot of the red heifer, this quality is overtly revealed, overtly revealed. For the mitzvah, the red heifer is not enclosed within reason. Therefore, this mitzvah represents the Torah in its totality. There are two unique dimensions in the offering of the red heifer. It makes the pure impure, while it purifies the pure. And B, it is offered outside the camp. So these are part of the problems with the red heifer and part of the inconsistencies which make it so difficult to understand. And later we'll explain we'll explain not the reason for it, but we'll explain why this is critical. So the first point about this mitzvah is that you say this water, the mixture of ash and water, of the red heifer, the ash of the red heifer and the water, has the power to purify. Okay, we understand that there's certain potions that can purify. But what's strange about this mitzvah, what makes it inherently contradictory, is the person preparing the water becomes impure. So in that way, it's contradictory. It makes the pure impure while it purifies the impure, right? So the person who's impure, the priest who prepares it becomes impure. The person who the water is sprinkled upon becomes pure. So that's a contradictory factor. Another point is it is offered outside the camp. All sacrifices must be offered in a holy place, in the temple, either in the tabernacle or in the temple. There's a mitzvah, you're not allowed to offer an offering outside the temple. This red heifer is considered a sin offering. It's called a chatat, which is the most holy form of offering, and yet it's offered outside the camp, outside the city of Jerusalem, but in Israel. So again, contradictory. If it's holy, why is it outside? And if it's outside, why is it holy? Again, that's the second contradiction. The first contradiction is, if it's pure, why does it make the person preparing it impure? If it's impure because it makes the person purifying it impure, preparing it impure, how does it purify the impure? So these are two elements of an internal contradiction. We can assume that these unique dimensions reveal a quality associated with the essence of the soul and relate to it, the Torah in its totality. So what's the Rebbe going to say? We have two interesting factors about the red cow. We know that the red cow represents the essence of all the mitzvot because it's the essential God's will. It's the essence of God's will. We know that we say this is the decree of all of the Torah. So somehow or another, these two details will tell us something about the essence of the person's soul and how we relate to Torah in its totality. In other words, we're going to come back to these two details. The fact that two contradictions. It makes the pure impure while it purifies the impure. And that it's offered outside the camp. This is going to be critical to understand ourselves and to understand the totality of our relationship with God. The impetus which spurs the essence of the soul to the service is sparked by Moshe, for only to him was the motivating principle revealed, and it is Moshe who conveys inspiration to all Jews. So that's what we were saying earlier when Medrash said that God says, only to Moshe do I convey the reason of the cow. And the point here is, Moshe is the one who inspires us to take the lesson of the heart of the cow to heart, as we will discuss. Hopefully, we'll have a few minutes for that. To underscore this dynamic, God commanded Moshe, speak to the children of Israel, and they shall bring to you a red heifer. It was Elazar, the priest, who offered the red heifer and carried out all the preparations for the sacrifice. Nevertheless, the Torah emphasizes that the heifer was to be brought to Moshe, for it was he who inspired the divine service that represents the spiritual counterpart of this offering. For this reason, the sacrifice is always referred to as the red heifer offered by Moshe. Moreover, each of the 8 red heifers offered during the era of the Second Temple, and even the final one to be offered by the Mashiach, used or will use the ashes of the red heifer offered by Moshe in the desert. So without getting into every detail here, we're saying here that ultimately Moshe, even though he wasn't the one preparing the red heifer has to be brought to Moshe, because whatever we're going to say about the spiritual meaning of the red heifer and how that connects to the essence of our soul, that's related to Moshe, because Moshe is the one who inspires us to understand that. Okay. Now we're going to start getting into the core here, the core interpretation. The goal is to do at least two more sections. We already did two. The goal is to do at least another two, but if not two, at least another one, because now we're getting to the core issue here. So the talk continues. The Medrash states that when God told Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher, about the impurity resulting from contact with a human corpse, Moshe's face turned color. How will such a person regain ritual purity, he wondered. So in other words, there's laws of ritual impurity. So the Medrash says, as soon as Moshe hears that the person becomes impure by coming contact to a dead body, he didn't understand. His face changes colors. It becomes dark. It becomes saddened. How could a person who touches a dead person become pure? Because we'll see in a minute, death represents the most severe impurity. And how could a person come back to purity after contact with death? So Moshe doesn't understand. And then God says, we'll see later, God introduces the red cow, and that pacifies Moshe. Moshe was not bewildered when God taught him about other kinds of ritual impurity, for they are limited in nature. But the impurity stemming from the contact with a corpse is the direct opposite of holiness. Holiness is associated with vitality. As long as one clings to the living God, there is no possibility of death. Death reflects separation from godliness, and therefore Moshe was bewildered. What the Rebbe is saying is all the other forms of impurity, okay, so there's a little bit of impurity, you can overcome it. But death represents the antithesis of connection to God, because God is synonymous with life. He quotes the verse where Moshe says, you who cleave to God are all alive. So life comes from God. The absence of life is the absence of God. So a person, when you come in contact with death, death is the absence of God. The absence of God, how could there be purity to such an absolute form of impurity? God resolved this question for Moshe by teaching him the laws of the red heifer. For the ashes of the red heifer overturn even this type of impurity. The sparkling of its ashes draws down the 13 attributes of mercy, which transcend all limitations and remove all blemishes. What are we saying here? We're saying logically, a person can get to a point where they're so disconnected from God that they're considered like impurity of coming in contact with a dead person. And Moshe logically cannot see how anybody can return from this impurity to the state of purity. You can't understand. And what's the answer? The answer is you're right. It makes no sense how this person could become pure. But the purity comes from God's mercy, which defies logic. Based on logic, it wouldn't make sense for this person to be pure. But God purifies the person because God has compassion, and that's deeper than logic. So that's God's perspective. But now we're going to look at the perspective of the person. For this reason, the red heifer is referred to as a chok, for within the ordinary limits of the spiritual cosmos, i.e. within both the private world of each human being and within the world at large, it is impossible to bring purity to such a level. For who can render them impure pure? Only the one, meaning only God. For he is not bound by any limits. In other words, what does it mean that the mitzvah, we're going a little bit deeper here. What does it mean that the mitzvah of the red heifer is not logical? It's not that we don't understand a specific part of the mitzvah, why, for example, why it's burnt outside, why it's prepared outside. That's not the problem. The real, when we say that too is illogical, but it all stems from a deeper difficulty. What's the deeper difficulty? How is it possible that someone who was so distant from purity could become pure? How is it possible that someone that reaches a state of spiritual death could become pure? That's the part of this mitzvah, the essential part of this mitzvah, which is illogical. Because that's illogical, therefore the details of the mitzvah are also illogical. But what's illogical is not the ritual. What's illogical is the spiritual transformation that someone who's as distant as death could become back to God. And that's illogical. And that's why it's illogical even within God's logic. Because even from the divine logic, it makes no sense that this person could achieve purity. So why does God purify the person? Not from God's logic, from God's compassion, which is much deeper than logic. Right? You have compassion on your child. Your child came home. They got a 50 on the tests. You knew they could have got a 90. Right? So logically, there should be no room for forgiveness or compassion. But compassion runs deeper than logic. So that's what we're saying here. We're saying the decree of the cow is not so much a specific detail. Why a red cow? Why not a brown cow? Why a red cow, not a black cow? That's details. It's illogical because the spiritual state of this transformation is illogical. And it's not that we don't understand it. It's not enclosed in God's logic. From God's way of looking at the world with law and order and what is proper and what is appropriate, it's not appropriate to say that this person could be purified. But the purity stems from a place that's deeper than God's logic, stems from God's compassion. That's God's will. God's will is deeper than logic. That's why this mitzvah makes no sense. Not only makes no sense to us, it makes no sense to God. Makes no sense means it defies the logic, but it's deeper than logic. Now we're going to explain one feature of the two features that we mentioned earlier. The second feature we mentioned is that it's offered outside the camp. So we're going to address that feature. We're going to say that feature, the reason why the sacrifice could be outside the camp, because its reach reaches everywhere. There's nowhere it can't reach. The purity of the red heifer could reach everybody, even those who are spiritually came in contact with death, and death is the antithesis of holiness. So just like it can reach anybody, it can reach any place. So because it's so powerful, it can be anywhere. Therefore, it's offered outside the camp, which is illogical, because usually if you want to come close to God, you have to change, you have to purify yourself, you have to come to the temple. That's the logical way of operating. But this is illogical. The illogical way is the holiness will come to you even if you're undeserving. On this basis, we can also understand why the red heifer is offered outside the camp, in contrast to all other sacrifices, which were offered within the Beit HaMikdash, within the Holy Temple. The Alter Rebbe explains that all the other sacrifices atone for unintentional sins, these being a result of intensification of the influence of the animal soul rooted in Klipat Noga. Therefore, they are offered within the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, the Alter Rebbe says that all other sacrifices are offered for sins that are done by mistake. Sins that are done by mistake come from, then we spoke about this in Tanya, there's two types of klipa. There's the klipa that's absolute evil, and then there's the klipa that has some light. So when I make a mistake, that comes from the klipa that has light. The red heifer, by contrast, atones for the ritual impurity stemming from a corpse, the very lowest form of impurity, below even klipat noga. Accordingly, it is offered outside the camp, for it purifies even those levels outside the realm of holiness by revealing a light that transcends the limits of the spiritual cosmos. In other words, this energy of the red heifer defies logic. It comes deeper than any orderly flow of energy from God to creation, which is usually logical. And therefore, it can reach anybody, purify anybody, and therefore it can also reach outside the camp, which represents that this person is associated with the klipa, with the unholiness that is most intense. Okay, now we get to the culmination. Now we get to the beauty, and you see why the Rebbe said this, because this is like right up the Rebbe's style, like big time. Okay, so what did we just say so far? We said that logically, Torah's logic, Moshe's logic cannot understand how this person who came in contact with the worst form of impurity should be purified. Can't happen. We don't understand logically. Logically, there's no formula for this to work. And that's why we say, even King Solomon says, I'm sorry, I don't understand this mitzvah. Yet God says it's a decree. What does the decree mean? Not just do it because I told you to. It means it comes from a place within God that defies logic. So God's compassion defies logic. So even though there's no rational way to allow this to happen, God can make it happen. Okay. How does the person elicit that within God? In other words, yes, it comes from God's compassion, but the person has to elicit God's compassion. We have to do something to touch that level of godliness, to trigger that unconditional love. And the reason what we do is, when I go beyond logic for the sake of another person, then God goes beyond logic for me. How do I go beyond logic for the other person? I'm the priest. That person is impure. He can't go to the temple. If I prepare this potion of mix the ashes in the water, that person becomes pure, but I become impure. Right? That was one of the hardest ideas to understand of what that inherent contradiction is. But what the Rebbe is going to say is this is the only way this mitzvah works, because how could I elicit within God the idea to go beyond logic for me is if I go beyond logic for somebody else. And the way I go beyond logic for someone else is I'll purify him at my own expense. That's the test that my commitment to another person is beyond logic. And because my commitment to the other person is beyond logic, that elicits within God that commitment to us beyond logic, and that's where purity could stem from. So we took the most difficult features about the cow. Number two, that it's offered outside the camp. And number one, that it makes the person who's preparing it impure. And we say, no, this is critical to understand what's happening here. Essentially, what's happening here is that we have a impurity that from the perspective of logic, there's nothing to do. There's no logical way. There's no formula to make this person holy if you follow logic. So the only thing we can do is rely on God's love, which transcends logic. But to elicit that, I have to show that there's a person here willing to be devoted to somebody else in a way that transcends logic. And if people could be devoted to each other in a way that transcends logic, that elicits God's compassion to us, to bring us to purity, even though it transcends logic. There's no logical way to fix the mistake that I just created. And that's how these two features, that it's outside the camp, meaning it could reach anybody. Even the person where logically you don't understand how could that person achieve purity. But how does that happen? Because of number one, because a person is willing to make himself impure for the sake of the purity of somebody else. So this is beautiful. I am a little constrained for time here, but I'm going to try to read two, three minutes, and then we'll stop for a question or two, and then we'll call it a day, and we'll resume talking about the cow next tomorrow. Not on this, not going to repeat, but on different angles as well, not just the Kabbalistic. Even though I can't guarantee you that there'll be no Kabbalah tomorrow, I'm sure there'll be some. Okay, here we go. Let's try to do this a little bit quickly. This is the fourth section. To draw down light, which is above the limits of the spiritual cosmos, one must tap a level of the soul which goes beyond all limits, a level of yechida, which is expressed through bitul. I have to touch the essence of my soul. The essence of my soul is totally humble. To put it simply, mesirut nefesh, self-sacrifice, is necessary. A person must put his concerns aside, go outside the camp, take a cow, indeed one which is red, and red is not a sign of holiness, right? Red is a sign of passion, right? Usually white is holiness. But the point here is I'm willing to get my feet dirty, so to speak, and prepare it as a sacrifice, knowing that he himself will thereby become impure. All this to enable other Jews to become pure. A person has to be willing to ignore his own concerns to do a favor for another Jew. Moreover, to help with the help which he offers must be given freely, without thought of personal benefits. Our sages teach more than the donor gives to the recipient gives to the donor. But when a person gives with such thought in mind, he has not transcended his limits. And so it is impossible for him to draw God's own essence. When does a person draw down God's essence? When he does a favor for another person, despite the knowledge that he will thereby become impure. Brackets, we say, God will certainly repay him several times over for his troubles, but this is not his concern. That's not why he's doing it. He should be willing to make the effort despite the fact that he thereby becomes impure. The lack of self-concern is the chok engraved in the very core of his being, and it draws down the transcendent dimensions of godliness, for only the essence of the soul can draw down God's essence. The fact that I'm willing, I'm going to stop here unfortunately, even though this is so sweet. The fact that I'm willing to do something for somebody else in a way that's at my own expense is not logical. It's not logical. It's a chok, it's a decree. It makes no sense. There's no way I can articulate why I'm doing it. Why would, if purity is such a value, why would I purify you at my expense? But the ability to do so stems from the essence of my soul. The essence of my soul goes beyond logic to commitment to another person. And the essence of my soul could elicit the essence of God. And the essence of God is to offer purity even to a person, which logically, there's no formula through which that can happen. So that is the story in short. A lot more to say. I think you could even feel the Rebbe's love to every person, because we know that Rebbe taught us, he himself did that as well, but also taught us the sacrifice of our own spiritual well-being to reach out to others and inspire others. And that's not why we do it, but by doing so, we go beyond our logic and we draw down God's light in a way that defies logic. In other words, that's beyond logic, that transcends logic, and that's the decree. The decree is that God offers us purity even when we're undeserving. So that's the story in short. A lot more to say. This is very exciting, but unfortunately we have to stop now, or a minute or two. Vicky, please share. your observations or questions or comments. In the meantime, I'll say l'chaim because this is too good.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. It is really beautiful and logical. And logical in a way, pun intended.
Yeah.
I had a couple of questions. So first question is, I understand Rabbi's like passion for helping other people, but it also signifies our commitment to Hashem because we are doing something that we don't understand, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that will, because our compassion, our commitment may elicit compassion as well. So that's this is not a question, this is just a comment. So probably acknowledges that. But my main question is why the contact with the dead person considered the most like severe that requires the most intense cleansing. There's no sin involved. The person was just burying their maybe close relative.
So you have to ask the literal law and the symbolism. The literal law is not that a person did anything wrong, but the phenomenon of death is the phenomenon of lack of holiness. So when the soul was in the body, there was holiness and godliness in the body. When the soul leaves the body, so the body now is disassociated from the soul. So by no fault of its own, the body is in a state of lack of holiness. So it's not a question of guilt. It's not a moral question. It's not that I'm a bad person, that's why I died, or because I died, I'm bad. It's not a moral question. It's a factual question. For whatever reason, going back to Adam and Eve, we all die, and death is not the soul. The soul is still connected to God. In fact, the soul is deeply connected to God because the soul returns to God. But in the place of the body, there's a lack of godliness. There's a lack of holiness because life and holiness and godliness are synonymous. It's not a question of guilt. It's a question of the factual reality. Now, but
we are talking about the person.
So now when we translate this to what is the spiritual meaning, so we're not saying by no fault, the most severe form of death, it doesn't mean anyone who died has this, but the symbolism of this is that I could attain a level of disassociation from holiness that is like death, meaning you see no connection to me and holiness. You don't sound like only I'm missing a little bit. That's other forms of impurity. But you look at me and it seems that I'm totally and completely disconnected to God from godliness. That would be the metaphorical death of impurity. And the point is, now you say, logically, could this person be rehabilitated? The answer is no. Yet the Torah says this person could be rehabilitated. So what do we say? This is not a logical mitzvah. This is a decree. What does the decree mean? Decree means it defies logic. Okay, how do we get God to defy logic? It's not just hocus pocus. We have to defy logic. When we do something, we elicit within God that ability, that desire to do so, to express his compassion. That compassion is beyond reason. So how do we do it? When we ourselves treat each other that way. And when
you answered both my question in the same sentence, like Rabbi did.
Okay.
But also maybe
I'm not doing much. If you noticed, you see, I'm just plagiarizing. You see, I put the screen up. I'm not making up anything myself. We're just reading it together and trying to internalize.
And maybe also the finality of it, because this is from humans' perspective, it's very difficult to deal with the finality of it.
Yeah, but in the spiritual perspective, we're saying it's not final. It seems to be final. You look at this person, looks like the finality. It looks like he's beyond hope. But then the red heifer says, no, we can deal with this purity, and we can't bring the dead back to life, But so the metaphor has its limits. But the point is, even somebody who flirted with this death of impurity, became so close to impurity, even he can be reformed and healed.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you. Thanks.
Wonderful day, everybody. Take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.